Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association Lunch and Learn webinar, Emerging Research Findings for Farm Worker Health. I'm Adrian Card, State Specialist in Produce with Colorado State University Extension and founding board member of CFVGA, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. This webinar is produced in collaboration with CFVGA and will feature research from CUSU work design scientist Dr. John Rosecrance, exploring stooped labor work on Colorado farms and highlighting best practices. CFVGA is the go-to resource for Colorado's fresh fruit and vegetable farmers. We connect Colorado growers with industry, government, academia, and consumers to strengthen and expand Colorado fresh fruit and vegetable production. Learn more at CFVGA's website and follow CFVGA on Facebook and Instagram. CFVGA work as a trade association in Colorado is made possible largely in support from sponsors, and CFVGA wishes to acknowledge those sponsors during this webinar. Platinum sponsors are listed on screen here. Here are the gold sponsors for CFVGA, silver sponsors, and more silver sponsors. And you can learn more about these vendors by going to coloradoproduce.org on the Growers tab and look for the directory of products and services to see what they offer to Colorado growers. Bit of housekeeping, we'll use the Q&A box for your questions. We're going to answer those at the end of John's presentation. You can resize Zoom, as many of us know, to fit the device that you're on, whatever works best for you. And you'll see a poll at the end of the webinar to look at educational outcomes and capture those. Our presenter today is Dr. John Rosecrance with Colorado State University, and I had prepared a long bio for John. He said, no, just introduce me as Dr. John Rosecrance. So John, with that, thank you so much for being here today, and we'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Adrian, I appreciate it. Before I get started the presentation, I would just say a little bit about myself. First of all, Adrian, don't use that picture again.
Okay, you got it.
I can send you something better than what you found on the web. My background actually years ago was in physical therapy. So that's sort of the perspective that I used to take. And it was great treating workers, but I was getting tired of that. And I thought, let's try to prevent some of these injuries and accidents and not see these people, or more or less trying to put myself out of a job. So I went back to school, did some research, and really what I like to do, and what I call is work design. I look at work design. Some people call it ergonomics, but really it's work design. How do we make work so that it's safer, it's more efficient, we have produce or products better quality, less scrap or less waste, these types of things. And so that's my background, and that's what I teach, and that's what I do. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now with you. Okay. This is a presentation that developed from work that we did with the CFVGA as well as Colorado University Extension. At the University of Colorado State University, I am a professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences. I'm on the biomedical science side and really primarily work with humans, and in this case, in agriculture. We have a federally funded agricultural research center with the acronym HICAUSE. It's a bizarre name, but this is a name that we use. HICAUSE, that's the High Plains Intermountain Center for Agricultural Health and Safety. And we do this work through them, and there's a lot of resources at HICAUSE, so I encourage you to look them up on that website, HICAUSE. Working with me on this project, we're Whitney Pennington, who's in charge of our outreach programs, and she's a great resource to know. So write down that name. You don't need to write down my name, but Whitney is the most important person. Federica Masci, she was a doctoral student with me, and now she's a researcher in Italy. Denali Sanders, one of my students, helped us out with this project. And then Giselle was a work study student that worked for us during the summer and help with the translation. She was invaluable. I want to talk about some harvesting tasks and weeding tasks in the sense or in the context of stooped postures. And you've heard of stooped postures, bending over. And so we'll talk about what stooped postures are and why we should be concerned with them. The products that we've been studying over the last year included some of the produce that we have here in Colorado, but also we've been doing this work in Italy. And when we were over there, we were looking at eggplant and strawberry harvesting. And I'll show you a couple examples of that because it pertains to the same concepts I'll talk about with stooped postures. Here in Colorado, we worked with producers of zucchini, onions, leafy greens, whatever they might be. Cilantro was a big one, corn as well. And then it's hard to make out what produce this is. This is a slide of weeds. I think next time I go out there, I'll just take a picture myself of weeds. This came off the internet, but that's what we have there because really that was a big part of this project was looking at weeds because of the Colorado Senate Bill 2187 that came across, talked about stooping, kneeling, and squatting. And so really, I want to focus this on these postures, especially the stooped posture. And towards the end or at the end of this presentation, I have some recommendations for producers when they start thinking about, what can we do about these stooped postures. And it may or may not be good to have such legislation where we have them dictating this. But on the other hand, I neither think it's necessarily good or bad. We have a lot of producers that want to do the best things, regardless of what bills or what ordinances are out there. And those are the ones that, of course, we really like working with. And luckily, we worked with many of them. As you know, stooped postures have been an accepted part of this work for centuries in agricultural work. And, you see it throughout the world. And so this is nothing new, but it continues. I was at an international meeting in Italy last year, and I saw pictures of workers stooping over and picking produce. And this was on health and safety, this particular meeting. And they never thought about stooped postures. And I said, in my presentation, I said, walk out your door here and you'll see posters of the postures that I'm talking about that you've taken. So in Colorado, this is typically what we see is people weeding like this, and this came from one of our studies. But today's topics are, what are stooped postures? Are there 2 stooped postures in this picture, or are there 3? Why are stooped postures a concern for me as someone in work design, or for someone in health and safety, or for someone who's an owner of a fruit or vegetable company? And then how are stooped postures measured? It's interesting because I believe it was the politicians that developed this standard. I'm not sure they ever thought about exactly what is a stooped posture or how we measure it. Luckily, in our research center, we have instrumentation. We can measure stooped postures and how long they're down in a stooped posture, how soon they come back up, how soon do they go back down, how much of the time are they in that position, and what position are they in. So we're going to talk about that. Also, how can we manage stooped postures on the farm? And I have a lot of ideas. And you may disagree, that's great. I'd love to hear more, but I have some I want to throw out there as possibilities. But when we look at these 2 workers, we can see these ones in the forefront here, they're using a long-handled hoe. So getting rid of the short-handled hoe didn't necessarily get rid of the stooped postures. And one thing I've questioned farmers and agricultural workers is, why are you holding the end of the hoe like this, or the middle of the hoe, I should say, and not the high end? And it could be for a number of reasons. Well, maybe they can't see it very well. Maybe the weed conditions, a number of reasons. But we see workers like this also that weed. And this is very common where they're weeding standing up using the top end of the hoe. Okay, now here are two farms. I don't see any stooped postures here. They're all standing relatively straight up. And again, it depends upon many factors of what is going to cause or lead to a stooped posture. The ground conditions, the moisture in the soil, the type of weeds, how dense the weeds are they close to the produce? There's a number of factors, and so we'll mention those as we go forward. So these are those two workers that we saw initially standing up, and now this is what I would call, these are both stooped postures. I'll define it in a minute, but we see at least on one worker, this fella in blue here, we see one actually best practice, and I think most of you can point that out, and that is, look how he's using the hoe. He's using the hoe as another support structure, and in doing so, he takes off so much of that stress. About 80% of the stress he can relieve by supporting the weight of his trunk with that hoe. And the area that we're worried about is the low back here, especially in the lumbar region, where when we stoop or bend over like this, we know that the stresses on the vertebra and the intervertebral discs that are in there is very high. And of course, when you come up into a straight position, then that pressure is relieved. And so that's why it's important to come up often. And we'll go into that more. Okay, more workers. This happens to be in California, not Colorado. But look at what they're doing here with the weeding. They have long-handled hoes, and most of them are in an upright position. So, and we see a lot of weeding like this. So generally, we're not too concerned about that. It's the weeding when they're in a stooped posture that we start thinking, maybe we should look at this in more detail. So what I want to do now is really define what we call a stooped posture. And this is based upon the research literature, primarily out of California. Their ag centers have done quite a bit up in Davis, as well as in San Francisco region. And so a stooped posture, well, let me just back up. What we think is a safe posture really is some extension of the back. So in a minus position, 0 means the back is straight. And when they bend over 30 degrees, we think they're starting to get into a posture where there is maybe a mild to moderate amount of stress. We're not so concerned about it as long as they don't stay that way for a number of hours. But we get more concerned when it's greater than a 60-degree angle. And you can, it's hard out in the field to take a measure and get it, but you can roughly sort of get an idea. Certainly, when they're at a 90-degree angle, when that trunk is at a 90-degree angle relative to the leg. And then when you start to go into a squatting position, as they are with the knees bent here, then the 60 becomes this region, and it can, you have a longer area of possible postures where you have those high stresses. So we want all of our folks try to work in the 0 to 30 categories here. In 60 and greater, again, that's what we define as a stooped posture. We want to try to limit the time in those postures. Okay, so what's the big deal about these stooped postures? Well, as I mentioned, that force is on the lumbar discs. And so we want to try to reduce that force as much as possible, because we know over time, this is sort of a cumulative type of disorder, you have a greater risk for low back pain and low back pathology, whatever it might be. And the risk of back pain goes up as you're in that sustained posture for a longer period of time. We know that. The key is, if you're in that posture, get out of it soon and then go back down. Okay, I have more on that as we go forward here. So this is a slide where I like to have audience participation, but maybe not possible today. So I ask you, what are other aspects of work or the worker that are related to increased risk of low back strain? So think about maybe your workers out in the field. What other aspects of the work or of the individual could increase the risk of low back stress because they're in a greater posture? Okay, I think by this time you should have at least one. I'll start sharing mine. Certainly the weight of the produce, or the weight of the tool, or the weight of equipment that they might be lifting. And so these are three things, because we know when you're in this posture and you're reaching out here, extended like that, and you're lifting a lot of weight, the forces in the back shoot up. They're quite high. And so we want to reduce the weight as much as possible. In my presentation today, I don't have any produce that is of significant weight. A zucchini or holding 5 zucchini would not be significant weight. So that's one factor. Another one, well, how long are they in that stooped posture? And then another one, the percent of work shift in that stooped posture. So how much of the work shift? All of it? 100%? It would be unusual if it was 100. What are the soil and weed conditions? What about the worker's history of low back pain? They're certainly going to be lifting differently if they have low back pain. What about the worker's physical condition? You know, you're not hiring CU or CSU athletes here that may be in great shape. And the worker's age, sometimes you don't have much control over that. And we know that as you get older, you have natural degeneration of the low back. And so you're more apt to have back pain, although there are some people 65 to 70 work lifting heavy weights for a long time. They have no back problem. So it's really individual. And the worker's experience at the job task. And I'll show you that directly. We know in all professions, most injuries happen in the first 6 months of hire. And actually, if you look at those 6 months, it's the first 6 weeks, and probably because they don't have the experience. And so we're going to talk about those. Okay, so how do we measure these stooped postures? At the end, I'm going to tell you how you can measure them without any instrumentation. We have this little unit here that they wear around their chest, just like on this mannequin here, and just like I'm putting one on this worker over here. This unit collects data on their position of the trunk, because it has an accelerometer that we use for that measure. It measures their heart rate, so we can get some physiologic data, which is especially important during hot environments. And it gives us also an estimate of their core temperature. So all three variables, or all three factors, we're very interested in. And this is what we use. And you can see the shirt has to come off. We put it on. It takes about 5 minutes to get this on. They stand up straight to normalize a standing upright position. And then we have them put their shirt back on and they go to work. And typically what we do with our research is we have them work for about 2 hours. If it's a very repetitive task, 2 hours is plenty, because we see it over and over again, and we don't need to go much more than that. Okay, so why are we concerned, or what are we concerned about in terms of these postures? I want to say that we're concerned about the magnitude. That is, how far are they bending down? 60, 65, 75, 90? Now, we're interested in that magnitude. And then the frequency that they go down and come back up. How long are they down? And how long are they back up? We want to know that, because that's important in terms of managing these kinds of postures. And then number 3, the duration of stoop postures. I've already mentioned that one. How long are they in that posture without coming back up? Because as soon as you come back up into an upright position, the lumbar stress goes way down, and you get a period of relief or rest almost immediately. And so that's really good. Now let's look at some of these postures that we see in this picture. Okay, now here he's in 90 degrees, and I hope you all agree that this is a stooped posture, okay? and because he's beyond 60. And here also, he's beyond 90 degrees here. Here he's right at 90, here he's beyond 90. But look at some of the best practices that these two are using. They don't have a hoe, they use their arm and forearm to support their trunk on their thigh here and here. And you'll see it again over here. These are best practices that you want to teach, certainly anybody new coming and doing this work, because this relieves some of the stress with the stooped posture. Okay, and now here we're not in a stooped posture. We're at an angle maybe 45 degrees, maybe a bit less. This is a squat. The reason they're squatting is to relieve all that stress on the low back. And you can see his lumbar spine, anyway, is nearly straight, taking all of the forces off. So this is why your workers are getting in some of these different postures, because it reduces the strain on the low back. And we'd like to see that. Here's an example of the magnitude, how far they bend down. The frequency, how many times do they go down and come back up? We know, for example, and you'll see it in a few minutes, if they're picking strawberries and they can pick 20 at a time, they're down for a long period of time until the basket's filled before they come back up. Whereas you pick zucchini or melanzane, they're down much less of time. Melanzane is the same as eggplant. And the duration that they're in these postures. And this is what we're most concerned about. How long are they in this posture? We know with the Senate bill, they should not be in that posture for what, no more than, I think, 20% of the work week. Well, we have to figure out, how do we measure that? Here's an example here of two types of harvesting. And this is from Italy. And I want to demonstrate this because of just what I was talking about. And the video may be a bit choppy, but what you'll see here is he's picking the eggplants, and he has to pick about 3 or 4, and then he puts them in the basket. And the reason why he has to pick 3 or 4 and it goes back is because he can only hold that many. And here he actually is down a bit longer, comes back up. He's searching for a zucchini, and a eggplant didn't find one. Whereas these strawberry workers over here, you'll see they have to fill a small plastic tub that they're holding, and they're bent over. Actually, we know how much time. You're going to see the results in a minute. They're down for about a minute at a time before they come back up. He comes back up, and you can see, all of everything they're using is stored on the ground, which is another issue. It's a design issue that we've raised. So that's the contrast of those two. And this is some of the data that we have from them. And the red are the strawberry, the purple is the eggplant pickers. And you can see in that category 4, here we had 2 categories that were safe. But now we're looking at this category here, beyond 60, or the stooping. The strawberry workers, half of their time, they were spent in that position, whereas the other workers only about 30% of their time. For the eggplant workers, most of their time, you add this bar to this bar, and you get more than 50% of the time, they're in an upright, safe position. That's what we like to see. Okay, now we're back in Colorado. Here, I want to contrast 2 activities that we looked at. And this is in manual onion harvesting. As you know, some onions are harvested manually, some are harvested with equipment, but in this case, this is manual. And you can see the 2 workers here. And they pick them, or pull them off the soil, and then they clean them up a bit, clean them, and then they throw them in the bucket. Once they're finished with the bucket fills up, then they put them in a sack. Now look at this is actually on the left, the inexperienced worker. He's only been on the job a few days, and he tends to stay down and do his work. He stays in a bent over position or stooped posture while he's doing the cleaning and clipping like that. Whereas the one in red on the right, he does most of his work in an upright position, or at least half of it, I should say. And so these are two very different work methods. And you can see with the worker on the left side here, he only comes up out of that stooped position once every 3 or so minutes to bag the onions. Now, let me just take you to my laboratory. We don't want that. So when I go back to the laboratory, I take that instrument that we put on their chest, and this is what we see, okay? When they're at 0, that's when they're straight up, standing up. And in this case, when this curve goes up, this is, well, here's 60 right here. That means anything above this line, they're in a stooped posture. So they go up into a stooped posture, and he more or less stays there for about 3 minutes, and then he bags and he comes, back up into an upright position, or not quite actually. And so that's his work. And this is what we're concerned about, is this prolonged posture before he comes back up. Now you'll see on the right here with this worker, absolutely he goes into a stooped posture, but then he comes out of it. He goes back into it, comes out of it, back and forth, back and forth. He spends much less time in a stooped posture, a continuous stooped posture, but also he spends some time in a posture where it's relieving the pressure in that low back and getting back to sort of a homeostasis point, even though it's a short time. And so much less risk involved in this kind of activity than the one on the left-hand side. With weeding, if you're weeding like this, with all these workers, we know that the majority of your time is spent in a very safe posture. Only 8% of the time, this worker's worker number 25, but all these workers were the same. 8% of the time, they probably had to go down and pull a weed or get something by hand. And so not much of the time. We wouldn't call this prolonged at all. And especially when you get so much rest break coming up, going down 8% of the time is little to no stress. It's what we do every day, even in an office setting. Now, what about this kind of weeding where they're a little bit closer to the ground? Well, sure enough, they spend, in this case, about 37% of the time in a stooped posture. And so, but they also, we know, get into this position. And why are they on their knees? To relieve the pressure in their low back. They know, how to do it. We would do the same thing. And what we also found is that if you look over the entire work shift, the average posture was 41 degrees. Remember, stooped was 60. And so it's great to see when the average is below the stooped posture level. Okay, so how do we manage these? Well, I have this is just some suggestions I threw out, and that is determine if you have stooped postures during weeding. Look and just see if they're bent over like that. If they're at the end of a hoe and just leaning forward, they're not in a stooped posture. If you want to take something out there, it's a 60 degree angle, and you can manage that. Determine if you have a prolonged stooped posture. Marilyn Drake, I think you all know that name. She asked me, well, what's prolonged, John? And I said, with the task that you've seen in this presentation, prolonged would be anything more than, I'd say, about a minute. You saw the strawberry workers. They were at a minute, a little bit less, a little bit more. That's a long period. And what's so important is that you come up as often as you can. So when you're out in the field, what I would say, just let 2 minutes go by and see how many times they come back up into an upright posture. If they come up 3 or 4 times in 2 minutes, that's less than being down for a minute continuously. So these are pretty easy to count. and then determine if there's significant weight handled with the stooped posture. If you're stooped over and handling something heavy, okay, what do I mean by heavy? I would say if you're stooped over and holding it out in front of you at an extended position, maybe 10 to 15 pounds. If you keep it close to the body, maybe more like 20 to 30 pounds. So it all depends on what that weight is. The goal is not to put workers in a situation that creates the risk of acute, chronic, or debilitating injuries. And so rather than focus, my whole idea here is rather than focus on stooped postures with weeding, look at all of the work that's done and try to minimize it or design some of that out. If you don't put things back on the ground, nobody has to go into that stooped posture and pick them up again. So there are some things you can do there. Also, some suggested steps: develop a plan to reduce the magnitude and duration of these, really the stooped postures. I like the kneeling and the squatting mixed in with the stoop. Really, they take a lot of the risk out, and so that helps out. Build natural posture breaks. Walking to another field, that helps. Perform another task, if you can. Drink water, because you have to stand up to drink in most cases, or kneel down. Change positions frequently. These are the same things I'd recommend with an office worker. Move out of that position. In the Senate bill 2187, they talk about giving the workers an extra 15 minutes of a rest break at the end of a period of time. If you're working 9 hours, you add 15 minutes each 3 hours. I can tell you, I don't think that does much good for a stooped posture, because once you wait that long for a break, it's too late. The secret here is to interrupt that prolonged stooped posture with a standing position. So my recommendation is, yes, give them that 15 minutes, but you give them 2.5 minutes every half hour. And that'll add up to close to 15 minutes after 3 hours. So if you can, somehow this is a management thing, somehow everyone stands up, just reaches for the sky, moves around, walks over, comes back. But just that short break is going to help more than a 15-minute break at the end of 3 or 4 hours. And so and they don't have to leave the field. It's more efficient, to stay there, because I know 15-minute break, that's 5 minutes walking out of the field, 15-minute break, 5 minutes walking back into the field. 2.5 is healthier and more efficient. And if necessary, as it says, provide knee pads and gloves. That's no brainer. And provide worker training on ideal postures and best practices. You already have these. I've seen them out there, and it's just identifying more of them. Train the new workers, or make sure the new workers coming in are doing these best practices. Okay, that's what I have.
Thank you, John. I prompted people to put questions in the Q&A. I don't see any yet. I have had, we got a question. I'll start with mine. I've had conversations with Whitney Pennington, the educational outreach lead for High Cause, about some cultural components to worker health and safety. We have had conversations around heat, and we can see in the image on screen, there's some perceptions around, at least in the area of heat, that, a big hoodie might be a good idea. It makes me think that part of the employer quest towards better worker health and safety is kind of a sociological edge of how do we message this and actually bring about the behavior change in the field, where we saw some workers not really engaged in the best practices in stooped labor. How would you message that as an employer? What would resound with these workers?
Well, Yeah, sure. It's an easy answer for me to say. And one is you don't have me come in there and tell them what to do
Hmm.
because you need to find those change agents in the field. I mean, look, everyone in extension knows what a change agent is because so many of them are change agents, but you need to find them within the fields there. And they're the ones that will drive the culture change. It's those leaders that drive it. I mean, sure, the business owner needs to be active in that because everyone knows the owners drive the culture, but the owners can drive it down to those that are change agents and trust, that have trust in their and the workers in the field. And there are natural, orders, with these workers and all workers. So that's what we have to do.
Hmm.
Um, and that's how we've done it in many other industries. And this is, we've had this conversation recently in our center in terms of some of the heat stress and how do we get how do we get workers to change clothing or consider other types of clothing that are um, protected from the sun as well as wick away, some of the heat or dissipate some of the heat and maybe wick away moisture. And so I think wearing those types of garments, it can change. I mean, look at construction industry 30 years ago, and I was working in it then. Um, Nobody wore a hard hat. And even the reflective vest, those weren't worn. But after a while, the culture changed, and it was part of the culture. You just know you don't go out without a hard hat or with a reflective vest.
Right, right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's cultural change within the organizations, and looking at maybe in your example, it's crew leaders that are trusted sources. Got a couple of questions here in Q&A from Marilyn. John, do you know if CDA plans to adjust their rule for the break times when weeding to give more shorter breaks like you recommended?
What was the question? I heard the statement.
Sorry. That does CDLE plan to adjust the rule for the amount of break times based on your recommendation of shorter, more frequent breaks?
Look, I can't answer for CDLA,
Okay.
CDA, Colorado Department of Agriculture,
Mhm.
or labor, but I think they could certainly consider it. Uh, they've heard this presentation that is the CDA, and it's something that they certainly need to be aware of.
You bet.
I mean, they can use it how they wish. I don't have any influence over them.
Right. And growers can maybe modify that within reason to fit more best practices. For sure. Another question here from Tim. What is the response of field workers to your practices? Is there kind of to our prior conversation, is there uptake? Are they interested?
Yeah, that goes back to your first question
Hmm.
about sort of cultural changes and with clothing and things with heat related stress. I mean, we haven't done any studies yet or any assessment of barriers or facilitators, to these changes. But we are talking to some of the producers right now about barriers, looking at barriers and facilitators for perhaps changing the clothing. In terms of these work methods, we just haven't assessed that.
Hmm.
Um, I don't. Well, I'll just stop there.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Working in extension for many years myself, back to some previous points you made, behavior change can take a while. Yeah, I think we're just beginning to see the rollout of new rules. And I think even if we set the rules aside, the work design elements are crucially important for worker health and safety. They also help with long term with productivity within businesses, as does all of the heat related illness prevention. So some of this is uh, hopefully getting integrated in what we're seeing in Colorado, a strong nudge for us to do even more of it. So you bet. Any other questions while we have John? And I'm going to pop a website in the chat for you guys. And Marilyn, this will be news to you. I just created this today through CFEGA's website, but this is promoting the other side of the equation of as we saw, hand weeding and hoeing, a demo day, June the 16th of this year in Rocky Ford at the Arkansas Valley Research Center, where I've invited and helped to coordinate with staff there at AVRC a field day where we'll get to see some of the most advanced automated weeders that can do in-row weeding and between the row weeding, so you can get almost a completely clean bed top. So this is emerging as some of the what some may dub the next revolution in agriculture. So we're beginning to see what some may call robots. These aren't necessarily robots, but seeing them in the field and taking the place of some of this most challenging work in vegetable production. So, yeah. Well, John, thank you so much for being with us today. And we so appreciate the work that High Cause does to support worker health and safety in Colorado and the evolving collaboration with CFEGA. So hats off to you and Whitney for doing such excellent work, and look to having many more years of work together with you.
Yeah, I want to say thank you, Adrian. And Adrian, what I want to also focus on, because I'm in work design, we make work safer. But more than safer, we want it to be more efficient and better quality of product. And that's what really sets us aside, because it's not just health and safety, but it's work design. And work design goals are production efficiency, better quality, better yield, these kinds of things. And we do that with every business that we talk with.
And that really sounds like a win-win to me, that workers benefit and the owner benefits as well. So that sounds like fabulous work for the produce sector. So again, glad you're engaged and look forward to working with you more.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining in.